Okay, we might make a start. Thank you, and welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us this evening or late afternoon in most places, this evening in Australia. And I would like to invite you all to the first of our professional expert series on healthy aging. As some of you may or may not know, 2021 to 2031 has been dedicated the decade of healthy aging. So this is the first in our professorial and expert webinar series about healthy aging. Just before we start, a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, welcome tonight and thank you for your time and for joining us. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please use the Q&A function. And we will filter through. Questions will be asked at the end, and I will address Professor Molasiotis with the questions. For any technical issues, please use the chat function. We have, as always, Erica and Louis on standby to make sure that everything is resolved as quickly as possible. Just a quick note, this is being recorded for dissemination purposes later on and for access. And please, when we're finished, stay on. There will be a short quiz at the end of the session that we'd really appreciate people completing. So that's it, sort of, I suppose, for the housekeeping. And now we'll get on to the main business. I would like to welcome Professor Alex Molasiotis to the James Cook University Singapore professorial and expert panel webinar series on healthy aging. And it is my absolute pleasure to introduce Alex. He is a dear friend and colleague. We've worked together for a number of years now, and I'm delighted that Alex has agreed to kick off this series for us. So let me just tell you a little bit about the esteemed presenter tonight. So Professor Molasiotis is the current chair, Professor of Nursing, endowed Professor in Health and Longevity, and Head of School of Nursing at the Hong Kong Polytechnic University. He's also the Director of the World Health Organization Collaborating Centre in Community Health Services at Polytechnic University, and the only centre with such a focus in Southeast Asia. He's the Editor-in-Chief of the European Journal of Oncology. He's been a Bloomberg International Distinguished Visiting Professor at the University of Toronto, and is a visiting professor at the Australian Catholic University in Sydney, the National University of Singapore, and he is currently a visiting and adjunct professor at King's College London in the United Kingdom, Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, Sweden, University of Technology, Sydney, Australia, and of course, James Cook University in Cairns, Australia. In addition, Alex has done a number of projects in the Western Pacific Island region, and he's an adjunct and visiting scholar at the Fijian University of TCM and Sichuan University in China. With over 270 international publications in peer-reviewed journals and several $1 million, we won't go into the funding that Alex has amassed over the last few years. I would like, with great pleasure to introduce Alex tonight to start this series. So over to you, Alex, and you can share your screen when you want to.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you for this nice introduction. Let me just share the screen. 1 second. And thank you also so much for asking me to deliver this first session. And we are going to be looking at some of the life expectancy, what happens in the Western Pacific, and some of the numbers around the issues that we have in this region. And when I'm talking about Western Pacific region, I'm referring to the WHO Western Pacific region. And WHO has defined as this region from Singapore, Laos, Cambodia, and all the way to all the Pacific Islands and anything that exists in between. So we're talking about 37 countries that spans from Singapore to all the way to Australia, New Zealand, and the Pacific Islands and Southeast Asia. So a big region but aging hasn't been really a key issue so far, except in some of the Asian countries in the region. I will speak about that a little bit. So the numbers are staggering. There are 700 million persons aged 65 years or over in the world last year. The number of older persons is projected to double to 1.5 billion older people by 2050. And globally, the share of the population 65 plus has increased from 6% in 1990 to 9% in 2019. This will continue to increase, and we have specific differences in some of the countries. For example, the population aging has been faster in the Eastern and Southern Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Population aging will put increased financial pressure on old age support systems. And we have some, in our region, some typically aging countries like Japan and Hong Kong, that 17.9% of the population is actually older than 65 years, and Australia and New Zealand with 15%. So quite aging countries, and also this is increasing. So the objectives of the presentation is to look at some of the results we got from a recent analysis we have done, looking at life expectancy, the factors that are contributing to life expectancy, years lived in disability during old age, and also to see if we can identify some clusters of countries that they have similar characteristics to develop regional health policy and planning. And this is something the WHO has asked us to look at. We have data from the Global Burden of Disease from the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation in Washington. This is an international database that every country provides specific data every year. And we have data for the last 30 years. And we focused on health variables, epidemiological indicators, and years lived in disability and mortality in the Western Pacific regional countries, and those between the ages of 70 and 94. And we have used a number of statistical methods to actually get our findings. So first of all, let's see if we can identify some countries that can cluster together. And we looked at a number of parameters. We didn't choose these parameters. These are all that we had in the data set. And we ran the appropriate statistical clustering analysis. And we identified across the 30-some countries, 30 plus countries, we identified 3 clusters of countries with similar health and social characteristics that actually could benefit from a more regional approach to managing problems in the older age. And one of the clusters was Mongolia, Papua New Guinea, and all the Pacific Islands came under this cluster. Another cluster was China, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Malaysia, and the Philippines. And the third cluster was Japan, South Korea, Brunei, Darussalam, Singapore, Australia, and New Zealand. And they had similarities in terms of health spending, in terms of out-of-pocket spending, the GDP, fertility rates, health quality indexes, and mortality rates, and so on. The first thing to highlight is the life expectancy for those that are 70 to 94. And I will speak about the 3 different clusters, and I hope you remember the countries that are incorporated into every cluster. So the more developed one, the third cluster, we see a significant increase of the mean life expectancy in those at the age of 70. And you can see in different countries, although there is variation, they all go up. And somebody who is, let's say, in Singapore, which is this yellow line, if at the age of 70, years old lives in Singapore, the mean life expectancy would be an additional 11 years. The same applies to several other countries. The second cluster, which is kind of middle income countries, I gave you the examples of China, for example, and so on. They also have an increase steadily, but not as much as in the first cluster. And the third cluster, which is the Pacific Islands, Mongolia and Papua New Guinea, PNG, we have some increase, but probably flattening out. But still, we should expect a few more years of life expectancy at the age of 70. So in terms of healthy life expectancy, which is the life expectancy that is free of health problems, you can see the numbers are decreasing significantly. I will go back one more slide to remind you the number of years. In the first group here, they are up to 11 years of life expectancy. These 11 years become 8 or 7. So we have a gap here with healthy life expectancy. So we expect those at the age of 70 in our region to live longer, but some of these years will be in poor health. And again, the picture is very similar to the life expectancy, and probably the time that older people will be in poor health will be about 4 to 6 years from that life expectancy. So we need to think about what we do with these 4 to 6 years of life that is not lived in healthy condition, and the needs that this population will have, the healthcare needs. So we looked also in terms of years lived in disability and socioeconomic variables, and the next few slides will be quite busy slides, but I just want you to see some of the highlighted numbers. The years lived in disability were linked mostly and consistently across different variables with the socioeconomic index, with healthcare quality index, access to healthcare, with GDP, educational years, and fertility rate per 1,000 at the age of less than 25, and total health spending per capita. And you can see that we looked at a number of factors, metabolic risk factors, NCDs, environmental occupational risk factors, behavioral risk factors, and almost across all of these, the same variables came up as the most important. So socio-demographic index, access to healthcare, GDP, healthcare spending per capita. It's interesting to see, looking at this variable, government spending per total health spending, that the government spending had absolutely no significant relationship compared to the other values in terms of improving years lived in disability. So health spending, government health spending actually is not necessarily linked with better outcomes. There are other things that are linked with better outcomes, as we see in this table. When we run the same analysis, not with years lived in disability, but rather with mortality, the picture was fairly similar. Socio-demographic index, healthcare quality index, access, GDP, education, fertility, and total health spending per capita. Again, no government health spending was linked with very strongly with decreases in mortality, and the same was true for private spending and out-of-pocket spending. So we ran a regression analysis to see some of these many factors, which one are the strongest ones, and we identified that in terms of years lived in disability, the most important were socio-demographic index, and total health spending per capita in dollars. We're on the same analysis with mortality. And in this case, the gender was very different in terms of mortality. And we had 1,272 deaths less in the females for every 100,000 population than in males, and the socioeconomic index as well. So we looked also at the mean government spending, and we have seen some interesting results here. In the developed countries, you remember Japan, Singapore, Korea, South Korea, and so on, we have significant contribution of the government to health spending, but it's fairly similar across across the years and quite stable. In the second cluster, we're looking at China and some similar countries who have some discrepancies. Sometimes they have more, sometimes less. But looking at the developing countries, PNG, Mongolia, the Pacific Islands, this was messy. There was no stable government funding. There were changes from year to year, huge differences. So the picture here for these countries in terms of government spending is quite chaotic. We looked at also the mean total health spending per capita. The developed countries, significant increase over the years from 95 to 2015. Very little improvement, probably the last decade or so in the second cluster, but in the third cluster, which is the developing countries that I mentioned, the mean total health spending was extremely low with small variations and not major contribution to the healthcare. One of the key issues in the aging population is the non-communicable diseases. And based on the reports we have, about 80% of the ill health problems that the elderly population is experiencing will be related to NCDs, non-communicable diseases, 80%. So we wanted to see different types of NCDs, what contribution they have to disability and also mortality later on. So we broke them down in different types of NCDs. And this first slide is looking at years lived in disability. And we're looking at metabolic NCDs, such as high blood pressure, high BMI, high glucose, and so on. And you can see in the developing countries, cluster 3, this is stable or perhaps decreasing a little bit over the years. But the second set of countries, China and so on, we have an increase in all these factors. And the third cluster, which is Mongolia, PNG, and the Pacific Islands, we have a significant increase in metabolic NCDs over the last 25 years. So big problem in the developing world with metabolic NCDs. Again, disability in relation to behavioral NCDs. Behavioral NCDs are smoking, low physical activity, alcohol use, dietary factors, and so on. Again, significant decreases in disability because of behavioral NCDs in the developed world. Stable, perhaps with some improvement in the second cluster. Again, looking at the third cluster of the developing countries who have some problems with behavioral NCDs and increasing significantly, particularly in the Pacific Islands. For the same things in terms of mortality, mortality in terms of metabolic NCDs has significantly decreased over the years in the developed world. In cluster 3, in the second cluster, as I mentioned, China, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Philippines, and so on, we have some decreases or stable. And in the Pacific Islands, PNG, Mongolia, we have, in most of the places, we have some increases in mortality related to metabolic NCDs. Mortality in terms of behavioral NCDs, huge decreases over the last 20 years in the developed world, significant decreases in the second cluster, stable in the first cluster, the developing countries. We also wanted to look at what I've just showed you in a different way and see specific countries and where they are. And the clusters are, the blue ones are the developed countries, the green ones are the second cluster that I mentioned, and the red ones are the first cluster, the developing countries, Mongolia, Pacific region, and PNG. So looking at the years lived with disability in relation to metabolic NCDs, the lower it is in this figure, the better. We have the developed countries are here with the blue, and we see that at the top is Fiji, but also Brunei, Kiribati, huge and significant problems with metabolic NCDs in the males, and the same applies to the females. So here we can actually see the mapping of the countries, and we can see again the developing countries, plus one of the developed, Brunei, has significant problems in relation to metabolic NCDs that haven't improved over the years. Looking at the behavioral NCDs and years lived in disability, at the top comes Cambodia, Laos, Philippines, Fiji again, but also we have some developed countries like Brunei and South Korea and Japan, and that is in 1995. The next picture is how this improved 20 years later. And you see South Korea still is more or less in the same place it was 20 years ago. Cambodia, Kiribati, Philippines are actually gone worse in terms of behavioral NCDs. The same picture is in females, but the females in the Western, in the more developed countries, they tended to have significantly less behavioral NCDs. In terms of mortality, in 1995 in males, Mongolia, Fiji was at the top. In 2015, Fiji remained at the top, although Mongolia has done a significant improvement in metabolic NCDs. Not much in the developed world, and the same picture was in the females. In terms of mortality and behavioral NCDs, again, 1995, Mongolia was at the top, continues to be at the top in 20 years later. We have here a number of countries from the second and the first cluster. But if we look at 20 years later, we see all these countries actually have gone up and worsened, but the developed countries have improved in behavioral NCDs and mortality. The same picture was for the females, but with different and lower numbers. So in terms of key findings, The issue is that the aging population in the Western Pacific region is definitely increasing, even in the developing countries where aging has not been an issue of priority so far. And that will create a significant health burden, both in terms of years lived in disability, but also in terms of mortality rates. And this will be more profound in the less developed countries, the cluster 1 countries that I mentioned. The key contributor to healthy aging is the socioeconomic index, the SDI. If we want to actually improve healthy aging, we need to see all the interventions that we do in the context of the socioeconomic index of the particular country or region. And we have seen with the data we have over the 20 years that socioeconomic index has improved across all countries to some degree, and has impacted on the healthy aging. The interesting thing from the data we looked at is that health spending was not a key contributor to healthy aging, nor it contributed significantly to mortality. So the amount of spending wasn't the key issue in improving healthy aging, is where this money was going. So that has significant implications to understand, because some countries actually provide, they increase the budget they have for healthcare in the older age, and they maintain the same things and the same services. And this doesn't necessarily lead to improved care. We need to rethink a little bit how we're spending that money and what services we need, and how we can connect some of the interventions we provide to the elderly with the context of the socioeconomic index they live, the social issues, and so on. And there has to be some coherence between the services. Health burden and mortality was significantly higher in males than females. And this is the same across the rest of the world. And also the health burden and the mortality were higher in the cluster 1 countries. Again, to remind you, Mongolia, PNG, Pacific Islands, than the cluster 3 countries, the more developed countries. So more older people are dying from illnesses, particularly NCDs, in the cluster 1 countries than the other 2 clusters. And the NCD burden was much higher again in the developing countries of the cluster 1, with little improvement, and in some cases worsening over the past 20 years. So these are some of the key issues that we found through the data analysis we have done. And some of these were fairly surprising, particularly around the role of health spending, where the government health spending, which at the moment it indicates that it's not well spent money, and also the role of the socioeconomic index that needs to be considered in the healthy aging, and to see also that cluster 1 countries, the developing countries, are actually having more and higher life expectancy year on year. So it's not really aging is not a problem just in some of the developed countries, the so-called aging countries like Japan and Korea and Hong Kong, but also it's becoming a major issue, health issue in the developing countries. And the developing countries are not really prepared to deal with the consequences of that aging population. So some of the points I wanted to raise is that as aging is increasing in all the Western Pacific countries, so is the health burden, particularly from NCDs. And we must do something about it. There needs to be some urgency in addressing the issues around the health burden of the aging population, and also address some of the NCD issues, particularly in the developing countries. we need to think about more effective ways to manage NCDs, and particularly at community level. And in many of the developing countries where NCDs are high in proportion and increasing over the years, community care is not strong, and we need to find ways of actually improving that. More health spending is becoming clear that alone cannot fully address this health burden, and different ways of spending are also needed. So it's not the amount of money that the government spends, but how we spend the money, what kind of services that we need, and also to address some of the issues of the aging population. And remember, we mentioned before that out of the life expectancy, several of the years that we expect, several of the years in this time will be in ill health. How do we manage that? And when I'm talking about ill health, I'm not talking just about physical problems. I'm not talking just about dementia. I'm not talking about NCDs per se, but also social isolation and mental health and other issues that we need to consider significantly. Last year, the UN, well, in 2019, the UN provided a report stating that population aging does not lead inevitably to macroeconomic decline. With well-chosen policies, just the opposite may be true. And we need to start thinking of how to make the population, the aging population, more engaged in the society, and also identify how we can address the social issues, economic issues that overburden the population, and so on, by bringing them back to employment in some way, or finding models that the older people will feel useful, they have an income to maintain a good quality life, but at the same time will contribute to the wider society as well. So this is a very important thing to remember, that at macroeconomic level, we need to think of how to engage the aging population in everyday activities and in the community. Well, to maximize the benefits and manage the risks associated with the population aging, government should support continuing and lifelong education and healthcare for all. Many of the older people want to continue learning, and actually here in Hong Kong, in my university, we have set up what we call the Institute of Active Aging, and we have more than I think over 1,000 volunteers, older adults that are coming and participating in education, but also helping in educating others with a vast amount of experience they have. In this way, they actually create a more healthy aging lifestyle. We need also to consider about encouraging savings behavior and healthy lifestyles throughout the life course. So we need to start getting some better data on how issues or situations that we experience in the childhood will have an impact in the middle age or the older age. If we look at some of the adversaries just isolated as part of the aging, or as part of the childhood, or as part of middle age on its own, then we are missing that life course approach. And we now have increasing evidence to show that what happens in the childhood or early life actually can have a health impact in the middle age or in the older age. And a lot of research is directed at the moment to identifying that life course issues and what impacts when. So in a better world, in order to actually make aging more healthy, we needed to start looking at providing better opportunities from childhood onwards in terms of health issues and so on. But this is the model that we need to start thinking about for the next generation, perhaps aging population. We need to promote employment among women, a very vulnerable group that is often excluded in the older age from many things. Also older persons and others that are traditionally excluded from the labor force, including through a gradual increase in the official retirement age. And we have aging societies, at least in the developed world, in this part of the planet. But the retirement age in Hong Kong is 60. In Japan is 60. In Cambodia is 60. Many countries are actually having 60 as a retirement age. So a lot of people nowadays at the age of 60 are at the top of their careers, fully functioning and able to contribute more than any other time. And this is a time that officially we exclude them from the labor force. This is something that needs to be rethought, particularly as life expectancy is increasing, because we need to fill a big gap in the labor force and also provide finances to the older persons to actually manage a healthier life. We also need to support family-friendly policies to facilitate work-life balance and also increase gender equality in both the public and the private life. And these are big highlights from the UN report. So to conclude, my last sentence would be that this is a time to actually take action to ensure that all individuals have the opportunity to live a long and healthy life. We have a gap of several years in the life expectancy that is going to be with not healthy life expectancy. How do we manage that? It's a priority for now. It's not for tomorrow. Governments and policymakers need to think about it very carefully, and they need to get a sense of urgency. We cannot delay that and wait for another decade before we can actually do anything. It's going to be too late. We need to act now, and we need to act efficiently, and we need to consider not just purely health issues, but health issues in the context of the social situation, the socioeconomic index of the individuals, in the context of finances and the labor market, and so on. So time to act now. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Alex. When you wish, just leave your slides up for a minute. We do have some questions. Look, they're really sobering results when you look at them across that 10-year period. But you know, looking at your developed countries, it was lovely to see that Singapore, in sort of across the whole of that 20-year period that was analysed, has done really quite well, and especially women in Singapore. So that was lovely to see. And what, for me, what that does is really supports the premise that for our local neighbouring countries, Singapore really has got a lot to offer to help support some of the more developing nations around us in these spaces around healthy aging. So that really puts a full stop and a line in bold around JCU's pillar for healthy aging in our Tropical Futures Institute. So that was really exciting for me to see. Now, I know that we have some questions, so I'll just work through those from the top. The first one, Alex.
A comment, Karen, before you progress to the questions
Sure.
On what you said. Singapore certainly has done a very good job because they started early and they started cohesively to actually look at policies and implement them. And actually, I'll give you an example. They very early understood that we need to attend to the social determinants of health and social participation. We need to address the social isolation in the older population. And they are one of the first to actually introduce what we call social prescribing, where the GP or a professional actually can make referrals to older people to manage social isolation in specific groups and try this way to to manage social isolation. This is happening now in a big scale in the UK. The UK has a minister for social isolation, which is a very strong political drive. So many countries had experiences with positive initiatives, and Singapore is one of them. Hong Kong has done quite a few good things as well. Any of the aging countries has done well. The problem is that we're not prepared to address, we're not prepared well to actually look at the developing world, where traditionally aging wasn't the top priority. It was infectious diseases, it was communicable diseases, and so on. And now we have that surge of an aging population with all the needs that they have, that we know very well, but with a system that doesn't allow them to be addressed well.
Absolutely. You know, I can't agree more with you know, with those comments and how early and swiftly Singapore moved in that space. So, Alex, we have got a few questions here for you. At the moment, there's about 4 or 5 on the screen. So I'll just read them to you if you don't mind. So the first one is, do advances in behavioural NCDs such as smoking e-cigarettes or consuming types of alcoholic drinks play a part in the trends for disease in mortality?
That's a very big question to be answered. I'll give you my personal view. I think they play a small role, definitely, because we have seen where actual cigarette smoking has been replaced by e-cigarettes or other similar products. We have less problems with respiratory issues, with lung cancer and so on. But the data we have, it's not really great. It's from small scale studies. And there is also a similar amount of data showing that actually cigarettes are as bad as normal cigarettes. So I don't think we have at the moment a clear answer on that. The clear answer is if you have anti-smoking policies, they help. And that's where I would like to leave this question. The same for the alcohol drinks. We have almost no data on that. So if I want to make an evidence-based response, I would say that probably not. And the policies that they're actually decreasing any kind of smoking or any kind of alcohol, they would have positive results. And if specific parts of that or types make a difference, we need to wait and see the data in the future.
Wonderful. The next question is around private health spend. And from the data that you presented, it looks like private health spend is not very effective. So the first part is that a correct statement? And the second part is, if this is the case, is it due to the data being looked at collectively? Whereas if just developed countries where private health insurance is more affordable or available, would we find different results about the impact of private health spend?
Yeah, thanks for this question. Yes, we actually analyzed differently the different clusters, the developed countries and the developing countries also. It was the same pattern. The private health spending didn't seem to play as big overall as we thought of. You know, that if you look at it carefully, that makes sense really, because the private health spending is not on community initiatives that we need for the aging population. It's not on social determinants of health and so on. They're private businesses that they provide better health. But better health is not the only thing we need in the aging population. We need better health in connection with better social determinants of health, equality, access to the labor market, attention to the vulnerable groups, management of some of the issues around social isolation, neglect, mental health issues, and so on, that the private sector traditionally doesn't do.
Yeah. Thank you. Again, that was another big question. It's hard, you know, and the next one, I think you could almost other entire presentation on. So the question is, what would be a more ideal retirement age?
Right. Well, certainly not 60 years old, that many of the countries in Asia and the Pacific, they have. 65 is an option. Many countries have it. There is a trend in some of the more developed countries to actually increase that to 67. So retirement age in the UK and some other European countries officially now is 67. So I think we need to think, you know, the number is not the issue. Is that number to reflect the realities of the aging population? If we're increasing the life expectancy and we're going to live longer, and we are able to actually have much of this time in a healthy situation, then there's no need to actually have so strict retirement ages. But if we're not going to do anything, 60 probably is okay, because there are going to be many years living in ill health. So we need to think about not the numerical age of retirement, but rather the developmental age of retirement, which will be very different from country to country, particularly around the developed and the developing world. But life expectancy is increasing, so we need to think seriously whether some of the traditional retirement age that we had set 13, 14, 50 years ago are still valid, and in many cases may not be valid, but in some cases may still be valid at the same time today.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. That's a really interesting question, isn't it? I think most of the viewers tonight wouldn't know that the World Health Organization's retirement age is officially 55, and then you have to apply for sort of 2 to 3 year extensions to that. And if we look at a number of the people in the WHO, they must have been reapplying for extensions.
Yes.
for many rounds. 55.
But, you know, there are economic reasons and other reasons why such limits have been set up by governments and countries or organizations that may have nothing to do with life expectancy or physical health or social health and so on.
Absolutely. So our next question is, I wonder if it's a pondering, but the question reads, I wonder if this data might be used in developed countries to show that they're already doing enough.
I wouldn't think so. I don't think we reached the level that we're doing enough. We have done a lot of progress in the developed world, not in the same speed from country to country. So some countries have done more than others, but we still have a few years of life within this life expectancy that's going to be with ill health. We still have social isolation. We still have issues that the older people living alone and the consequences of that because of the urbanization situation and children moving to big cities to work and leaving families behind. So there are a huge number of issues that have not been dealt effectively. And also I must say that probably we've done better work in the urban area, but we need to start looking at rural and remote areas and how to provide healthy aging in these communities that are more isolated by definition. So we really haven't done enough to suggest that.
That actually leads very nicely on to one of the next questions. So this is from one of our professorial teams. So the question is, solutions for the impact of social isolation on health. Does forming communities of aged people work, or does this just isolate them as a broader group within the community?
So I'm trying to reread the question. I'm personally against communities of any kind that they kind of become a ghetto. Because it's very easy to start with an ideal community and end up being a ghetto. So I would prefer to have communities that are balanced, look at equality within these communities, look at balancing issues around gender, about closer access to healthcare and so on. I have seen and I have visited some of these communities, and China has done some great work in creating some really luxury communities, similar to some of you. You may be aware, the Florida older communities, but much better. And I was impressed. When I visited some of these facilities, I said, I probably would live here. But then when I went back home, I thought, no, I don't want that. I want to be closer to my children, to younger people, to the city, to all the things that are my normal life otherwise. So why to actually create a new normal life within a very defined community? I don't see that working for me. But there might be other people that they may love this idea. And actually, when I visited these communities in China and some other places, they were extremely pleased to be there. Very well organized, providing absolutely all the things that we need to provide, from social, but also health issues, with the mini hospital, with the social interactions, with the games, with the attention, with and so on. So I suppose this is not a black and white. It's some people will like that and some people not. So if it benefits a certain part of the older adults, there's nothing wrong in having some communities, organized communities, to address some of these issues. But some others also were not going to like that. And I'm going to be one of them.
Okay. Look, I am very conscious of time, and I'm conscious that you have a board meeting that you have to go to after this. So we have one final question, and it's a curly one. So in your opinion, what steps or policies can we take to promote greater work-life balance?
Well, is that the $1 million question, or many more $1 million questions? Starting from myself, I haven't found the work-life balance, and many others haven't done that. But it's about, I think the work-life balance will be different from one person to another. And it's what makes us feel more comfortable and happy with what we have and what we have around us as well. So this is, you know, we all live very busy lives, and we don't often sit back and reflect on our life and what is good within that and what is not so good. And maybe we need to be doing that every few years and prioritize or reprioritize what we have in our lives and what we do. And as I said, work-life balance will be a very different thing from one individual to the other, but it's important to have it. In terms of the older population, in interviews we have done more recently here in a study we're looking at employment issues and going back to employment with the older people. And they're very keen to re-engage with employment. So all the things that we hate about working while we're young adults or middle-aged, then you come to the older age and you appreciate and you say, yeah, I want to go back to work in the same probably situations and problems. So I don't think there is a magic answer with that, but definitely we need to look inside us and identify what works and doesn't work for us, and see how we can manage a work and life.
Wonderful way to end. Alex, I'll just get you to stop sharing your screen if that's okay.
Yeah.
And just a reminder to those left online, there will be a short questionnaire that will pop up. But Alex, on behalf of everybody at JCU Singapore, and of course myself as Dean of Research there, thank you very much for your presentation tonight, and thank you for kicking off our Healthy Aging series. I can't think of a better way to set the benchmark, and you know, you are welcome. Love you to join the rest of them as well.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, everybody, for listening and for the questions.
Take care.
Bye-bye.